Okay, Professor Cheng, I would like to introduce you to in front of our students that this is Professor Cheng Ming. He is the professor of physiology from the Faculty of Medicine, Malaya University or University of Malaya. As you know that Malaya University is the one of leader university in Asia, yeah. Uh, Even maybe one of the good university in the world, and a lot of innovative or research or publication from Malaya is very productive, including Professor Cheng. And Professor Cheng is the best friend of physiologists of Indonesian physiologists. I think Professor Cheng already came maybe most of the place in Indonesia, Professor Cheng, yeah, to Jogja, to Jakarta, and Professor Cheng ever came to Palembang in 2010. Professor Cheng, if you remember, you
2009.
found the big shell, yeah. You found monkeys, yeah, when you came here in 2010. And Professor Cheng is also my best friend. We openly meet in Malaya in Kuala Lumpur because every year that we send the student to join the International Physiology Quiz in Kuala Lumpur in Malaya. But maybe it's simply that for this year it was postponed because of the pandemic. Maybe we hope that next year we can send one of you, of students who join webinar today, to see the Professor Cheng in Malaya next year. We hope so. Okay. And Professor Cheng, maybe we can meet openly to meet each other in Japan, Professor Cheng, in Birmingham, yeah, can several times we met Professor Cheng. So today, Professor Cheng, we will talk, give lecture to us about the transmembrane sodium gradient. And Professor Cheng already sent me a key concept or principle in physiology about the transmembrane sodium gradients. And I will share, I ask your permission, Professor Cheng, to share this one to all of the students. It's okay
Yes,
for you?
please. Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
And all of the students and Professor Hardy, that we can know that the transmembrane sodium gradient is very important topic in physiology and also in medicine. We can know that all living cells have transmembrane sodium gradients, and most of the diseases is have correlation with the transmembrane sodium gradient. So this lecture today is very important for us, yeah, especially for you to know better or to know more about the disease, about the physiology. So you have to understand about the transmembrane sodium gradients, yeah, because you can learn better about the neurotransmitter in neuron, potential action in muscle, the disease in cardio and vascular and everything. Yeah, you can easily understand if you understand about the transmembrane sodium gradient. So today I would like to invite Professor Cheng to give short lecture about this one, and maybe the time is running. So please, Professor Cheng, to give the lecture, and I hope that you still have a time to discuss after that,
Okay,
Professor
sure.
Cheng. Okay,
Yeah.
please let Professor Cheng to share his PowerPoint.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for coming. I'm glad that, as Dr. Irfan said, that most of you are first years, just starting medical program, and also as I understand, you may not have actually started physiology, but the aim of this series of talk is to try to extract some major principles in physiology, so that when you understand one of the major principles, then you can apply it to other organ system, as the Dr. Irfan mentioned. So I have, in the last few weeks, decided to do this. So I think all of you have that set of notes with you, in front of you. If you haven't, then Dr. Irfan will send it to you later on by email. So, so basically, these talks have been designed to be short, not too long. So I just gave the same talk to a medical school in Myanmar 2 nights ago, and although I call this 21 minute because this is 2020 and then we are moving into 2021, but the first talk I gave to Myanmar was about 16, 17 minutes. So it will be very short, and hopefully the points that are mentioned here, there are 11 points. I'll just elaborate slightly. And then hopefully for those of you, especially first years, you can use this major concept or principles as a guide to more of the physiology you will be learning subsequently. So what we are trying to do here is to try to tease out certain major, what you would call cross-organ principles, so that the same mechanisms you will see applies to various events throughout the body. Okay, so I will just go through all the 11 points and we should finish within 20 minutes. So, and if you have not received the page of notes, Dr. Irfan will send it to you. But in the meantime, you can write because they are quite easy to follow, okay? The first point is that all living cells have a transmembrane sodium gradient. Transmembrane meaning across the membrane. As long as the cells are still actively producing energy, it is able to maintain this, what we call a transmembrane sodium gradient. Now the second point, we have 11 points here. Second point is that this sodium gradient is directed inwards. That means there is more sodium in the outside the cell, what we call the extracellular fluid, compared to the sodium concentration inside the cell, the intracellular fluid. So the gradient, this gradient is directed inwards towards the cell. Third point is that for the first years, you will learn soon that all living cells are also, okay, we have here the share screen. Third point, all living cells are also polarized, electrically polarized. And this means that if you look at the external surface of the cell membrane, it is slightly positively charged. And the inner membrane is also slightly negatively charged. So all living cells are polarized. And of course, for those of you seniors, you will know that in excitable cells, the polarity is higher. So when we say excitable cells, we mean cells that are able to generate an action potential. So in, for example, nerve and muscle, the value of the, what we call the membrane potential, this polarized cell, is higher compared with, for example, the red blood cell. But anyway, since the inner side of the polarized living cell membrane is always slightly negatively charged, the full name of this transmembrane sodium gradient is called transmembrane sodium electrochemical gradient, because sodium is a cation, and so the slightly negatively charged inside the cell tends to attract sodium ions. Okay, the fourth point, and this is obviously common knowledge for the senior students, is that this sodium electrochemical gradient is sustained by the living cell membrane sodium potassium ATPase. So this pump, a universal ubiquitous pump present on all living cells, will always pump sodium out of the cell and pump potassium into the cell. And it obviously uses the hydrolysis of ATP. Okay, so pump sodium out and maintains a low intracellular sodium concentration. So fourth point here, I give you a rough value that inside the cell, the sodium concentration is about around 14 millimole per liter. So I said earlier in the second point that when you look at this gradient, the sodium concentration is 10 times more outside the cell. So outside the cell, in the extracellular fluid, is about 140 millimole per liter. So it's easy way to remember. 140 outside millimole per liter, about 14 millimole per liter inside the cell. So just to develop this point, so here we are saying that the intracellular sodium concentration is controlled by this sodium potassium ATPase pump. So be very careful. We're talking about the intracellular low sodium concentration. Now, it is not true to say that the extracellular sodium concentration is also controlled by the sodium potassium ATPase. Okay, so we won't go further down that road because this is under some endocrine physiology. So let me just repeat. The intracellular sodium concentration is controlled by the sodium potassium ATPase pump to keep it low inside the cell so that you always have this gradient. But the extracellular sodium concentration is controlled by a different homeostatic mechanism, which you will do later in your physiology. Now, the fifth point is one of the major conceptual principles that you need to appreciate, and that is many physiological events in physiology exploit this sodium transmembrane electrochemical gradient. And we have this tagline, no sodium gradient, no life. And I'll give you some example in a short while. Okay. So there's always this gradient. And the sixth point is that sodium cations, mainly in the ECF, extracellular fluid, can enter the cells via its specific sodium ion channels. You learn this for the first years. And these channels are not always open. They're only open on special occasion. And so we say that these channels are gated. You know, it's like a gated community. So I put this sentence here. So the cell is like the condominium. So I call it the cellominium. Okay. So this is the gated cellominium. When you think about this, pathway for sodium to enter into the cell. Okay. Now, and the seventh point is that depending on the cell types, so as you move from muscle to maybe to the nerve, it can be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, that depending on the cell type, the sodium specific channels can open or close in different ways. Sometimes it is through changes in membrane potential. So these ion channels will be called voltage gated sodium channel. Sometimes these channels, for example, in the smooth muscle cell, okay, blood vessel, are open when they experience some mechanical pressure. So we will call them mechanically gated sodium channels. And sometimes, as Dr. Irfan mentioned in the introduction, at some of these, at the synapses, they are open when the neurotransmitter bind. So neurotransmitter is a chemical. So we call this chemical or ligand gated sodium channel. And in a special case, the fact that you can see photoreception for your vision, the sodium channels are actually activated by light. So these are photo-gated sodium channels. And so as you progress through your physiology program, you'll find that there are different sodium channels that are open or closed depending on the membrane potential, depending on the mechanical pressure, or depending on the chemicals that bind to the membrane. And so these are gated channels. So once the channels are open, your gradient is already there, the sodium electrochemical gradient. So there will be a sudden influx of sodium. So this brings us to the eighth point, that in excitable cells like the nerve and the muscle, this sudden influx of sodium, in most cases, actually produces the first phase of action potential, we call this the depolarization phase, because all living cell membranes at rest are polarized. So there's a reversal or depolarization of the membrane. And this is due to the sudden sodium influx down its transmembrane electrochemical gradient. Now, besides this action potential, which is transmitted both from your sensory nerves and also the motor nerves, it means all the electrical impulses in the body involves this movement of sodium down either your motor nerves or your sensory nerves, and also happens at the synapses. Okay, so point number 9 is that this gradient is not only important in the electrical transmission of messages in your body, but this sodium electrochemical gradient is also exploited in cell membrane transport mechanism of solute entering the cell or leaving the cells. Okay, so and to elaborate a little bit more, point number 10. So this is sometimes called sodium couple or link transport. In other words, the movement of the solutes is linked to this potential energy which is present in the sodium electrochemical gradient. So if the sodium electrochemical gradient brings solute into the cell, or we call this, since it is brought in together with the sodium, we call this symporter into the cell. If the sodium gradient is exploited and the energy is used to bring solute out of the cell, we call this antiporter. This is in opposite direction. So I give you two examples here. Point number 10 is that every time after a meal, when you absorb your glucose from your food, sodium comes into the cell, into your intestinal cell, by using the sodium electrochemical gradient. So this is a good example of a glucose sodium symporter. Now another example is the antiporter in opposite direction. The sodium gradient is exploited in the kidney, for example, in order to secrete your hydrogen ion. And this is part of the overall process whereby the pH of your blood and the body fluid is controlled very carefully. And let me give you another example, that as you look at the cardiac muscle, the way in which your cardiac muscle can contract but also relax is because during relaxation, calcium from your myocardium, the cardiac muscle, is pumped out of the cell by using a sodium calcium antiporter. It means the gradient is exploited in order to decrease the calcium concentration within the cardiac muscle so that the cardiac muscle can relax. And so you see again and again that this sodium electrochemical gradient is used not only for the transmission of electrical impulses along motor nerves and sensory nerves, but also in the transport of solute into the cell and also out of the cell. And the last point, just to develop and to give you a terminology, since this sodium electrochemical gradient is established by the sodium potassium ATPase pump we mentioned earlier. So this sodium potassium ATPase pump is called a primary active transporter. And so since the sodium gradient that brings in solute or brings out solute of the cell is linked to this primary active pump, the sodium couple or sodium link transport is sometimes called the secondary active transport. Okay, so these are the 11 points based on the sodium electrochemical gradient, and I hope that especially for the first years, that as you move on in your physiology program, you will remember this tagline: no sodium gradient, no life. Thank you very much. Yeah. So how many minutes was that? I think it's about 20 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
We started at 44. So
thank you, Professor Cheng. It's a short talk. It is very fundamental and very interesting talk about the sodium gradients, and all of the
We can't hear you, Irfan. Your mic is muted, I think.
Hah? Halo, tes, tes, tes.
Okay, we can hear you now.
Iki mati lah. Iki mati. Iki mati. Hello, Professor Cheng, can you hear me now?
Now I can hear you, yes.
Oh ya ya, ini nah mati di sini ya. There is technical problem
There's
with
no problem.
technology.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
We have to wait someone who understand that. Okay, Professor Cheng, I think this very fundamental talk and very interesting talk about the sodium channel, and all of the students actually they already learn about this. Not much, I think that's just introduction lecture about the action potential in this block. I believe there will be question for you. Okay, student, please, if you have any question. Actually, in this room, Zoom too, we can see the Dr. Harry. Dr. Harry Asnawi. Hello, Dr. Harry. Ada ya? Okay. Okay. Students, please, if you have any question about what have been taught by Professor Cheng, please give your question. If you operate in English, you can ask in Indonesia. I believe Professor Cheng also understand Melayu.
Yeah, sure. Yes.
Oke, adik-adik semua silakan kalau ada pertanyaan atau mungkin dari chat juga boleh. Silakan tentang potensial aksi, tentang gradient channel natrium atau sodium. Boleh. Bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia juga boleh. Silakan. Nanti ditranslate.
Pakai Google.
Sudah, chat sudah. Ini chat siapa? Belum. Oke. Student, please. No question. Who ask the question will get present. Okay, two participant raise hand. Okay, who is raise hand? Two participant raise hand.
Dari Gamma, Dok. Nah.
Gamma, ya, okay. First one is the lady ya. Siapa nih? Okay, unmute, please unmute.
Yeah, please unmute and ask.
Siapa namanya? Ya. Okay.
Nadira.
Nadira, please give your question to Professor Cheng.
Okay, thank you so
Hello.
much, Doctor. Hello, Doctor.
Hi, Nadira.
My name is Nadira Suraya Ramadhani, and I would like to ask a question. Before, when I was still in the middle high school, I had an experience before when I suddenly can't feel anything in my limbs or numbness. So is there any connection between those ion pump and those numbness? Like, are those pumps being unactivated, or is there any other factors that made me feel numb?
Numbness is a very non-specific feeling, but whatever it is, the perception of whether it's pain or the temperature sensation, in terms of the electrical messages, it always involves sodium influx. All action potentials involve sodium influx in the depolarization phase, whether it's motor nerve or sensory nerves. Yeah. So the actual other details of the mechanism, why you perceive it as numb in your brain, obviously involves other things. But the basic electrical message is always sodium influx, and obviously followed by potassium efflux. Yeah.
So it means that even though I didn't feel anything, but my iron pump is still being activated.
You feel numb. Well, if you feel numb, that means you still feel something. That means it's the sensation of numbness. Yeah.
Oh.
But maybe you are asking, okay, for example, one of the ways in which you can prevent messages from your pain receptors to the brain, and this happens during anesthesia, is to actually block the sodium channels. So if you block the sodium channels and they cannot allow sodium to influx into the cell, that means you cannot transmit an action potential from your pain receptors. So this is one way in which certain local anesthesia can actually work. Yeah.
Oh. So it has a similar way like an anesthetic.
You can say that, yeah, yeah.
Uh, okay. Thank you so much, doctor.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Nadira. Good question. So please, Yos Safat.
Okay.
Okay. Second one, Yos
Okay.
Safat.
Thank you for
Hello.
the hello, doctor. Thank you for
Hello.
the opportunity to ask
Your
me.
mic is a little bit
Hello.
soft. Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay. Thank you, doctor, for the opportunity. I want to ask about: is there any factor that disturbing the transmembrane gradient, the sodium transmembrane gradient? Uh, sorry, my English was.
Gradient, yes, that's correct. Yeah.
Is there any factor that can involve the sodium transmembrane gradient imbalance? That is my question.
Is there anything that can increase or
Uh,
interfere with it?
yeah,
Failure.
that occurs the imbalance of the sodium transmembrane gradient.
Sorry, can you ask that again? Is there anything that can interfere with the gradient?
Yes, interfere. Yeah, interfere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Disrupt the transmembrane sodium gradient.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. If you interfere with the function of the primary ATPase, because the ATPase is the one that sustain the gradient. So all living cells uses energy to sustain the gradient. So if the sodium potassium ATPase is the activity is interrupted, then obviously you will not be able to sustain both the sodium as well as the potassium gradient.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor Cheng. Maybe I get a question also, but according to this one, how about the condition like hyponatremia or hypernatremia or dehydration? Is it have influence to these gradients?
Yeah, I think because the gradient is quite steep, is 10 times outside compared to the inside, so that when you have a situation whether you are hypernatremic or hypo, so even if you reduce the 140 to let's say 125, the gradient is still steep enough so that when the channels open, I don't think the effect on the flux will be that significant. Yeah, because it's a very steep gradient. Yeah.
Very steep gradient. Okay, thank you very much.
Gimana dok? Iya.
Tidak ada pengaruh.
Kalau
Lalu seandainya dia dehidrasi. Okay, please apa nih? 27 Alpha. Saripa. Okay, Saripa, please.
Thank you, dokter.
Hello.
My name is Sharifah
Hi,
from
Sarifa.
Professor. I want to ask you about actually what is the highest phase in the membrane transport scheme, whether action potential or hyperpolarization? Because I found several different charts. Some of the hyperpolarization are below, and some are above of the chart. So I confused rather than uh, hyperpolarization or action potential. Thank you, sir.
I didn't quite get your question. Sorry, Sharifa. You're asking about the difference between an action potential and hyperpolarization. Am I right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. When the action potential happen at the peak of the action potential, because of the sodium influx, it actually reverts to a positive charge for a short while. But when the cell is hyperpolarized, by definition, it means that the membrane potential has become more negative, so further away from the threshold. So in fact, you need a greater stimulus to depolarize the membrane to reach the threshold before it can fire the next action potential. Yeah.
I see, I
That,
see.
yeah. Does
Yeah.
that answer your question?
Okay. Is it answer my question? Thank you, Professor.
Right.
Okay, good one. So please, who is this one? Gamma 01. Uh, Gamma 01. Who is, I don't know. What is your name? Ratu Saripa. Please, Ratu Saripa, to unmute.
Belakangnya manekin kan? Kayak di sini.
We cannot hear you. Ratu, please, louder.
Louder, yes, please, yes.
Previously, the thanks for give an opportunity as I thank you for Doctor for allowing me to stand here. And as I welcome to Professor Dr. Cheng for allowing me to give a question in the section. For today, I have a question. Is the point number 4 of SAR screen is the state if not have a sodium gradient, it's not life. And I have a question: why sodium is so important in the life? But why sodium like that? Thank you.
Oh, you're asking why sodium?
Why sodium is more important in life?
Why sodium is the most important? Okay, Professor Cheng, you can answer that. Okay.
Yeah, I can just about hear you. Sodium is the extracellular major electrolyte. So the highest concentration of any electrolyte in the outside the cell is sodium.
Yes.
And it's not just the concentration that we want to memorize as a fact, but we want to as try to emphasize this morning that it is high outside and compared to inside it is low. So this gradient for sodium is exploited in electrical messages as well as in many other solute transport. So and of course there are also other gradients which we can hopefully talk about in subsequent talks. For example, the potassium gradient is also exploited for other physiological process. But this morning we're just focusing on this one essential sodium gradient, without which you cannot transmit any action potential, without which you cannot transport solutes into the cell and out of the cell. Yeah. So if you're asking why sodium is used in this manner, well, it could be any other ions, but it's just that sodium is highest in the ECF, and the cell exploit this gradient for depolarization as well as for some of the couple or link transport.
Yes. Okay. Can you get it, Ratu? That sodium is the most abundant electrolyte that already been in the cell. Okay. Thank you. Now I will ask already.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay. Please, Muhammad.
Ini, saya dulu. Pin dulu, pin.
Pin dulu. Please, Muhammad. Muhammad Akil. Please give your question to Professor Cheng. go di situ.
Tidak, bukan.
Halo Muhammad.
Yeah, please, Muhammad.
Agil. Oke, cerita dulu.
That there are hyperpolarization term after falling phase of the action potential because the membrane potential is too negative or smaller than -70 millivolt because the potassium pump is late to close. And what I found in article to normalize it, we need potassium sodium pump. And what I know about the sodium potassium pump channel, make 3 sodium ion out of the cells and 2 potassium ions into the intracell, which is can normalize the composition of both sodium and potassium in outer or intracell. But logically, it can make the intracell more negative because both have positive charge. So how can this potassium sodium pump can turn the hyperpolarization into resting state again at minus 70 millivolt? Or is there any method, Professor? Thank you.
Yeah,
Prof.
thank you for the good question. Yeah, so Muhammad is asking the question, and he has given some detail that if you look at the primary active transport, it actually pumps three sodium for every 2 potassium into the cell. So he's asking about how. So sometimes we call this a electrogenic pump because it is able to. The 3 charges goes out, and 2 charges is pumped in. And so he's asking how can we relate this to the resting membrane potential and also the action potential. This is obviously covered in more detail in your lecture, but just to summarize very quickly, the resting membrane potential is actually not mainly due to the sodium potassium pump. The contribution of the sodium potassium pump to the resting membrane potential of minus 670 is actually less than 5%, although it's electrogenic. The main contribution is actually due to the transmembrane potassium gradient, something to do with the fact that the cell membrane is more permeable to potassium generally compared to sodium. And I don't know whether you have done something called the equilibrium potential. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so during an action potential, actually it is basically due to passive fluxes of sodium during depolarization and passive fluxes of potassium during repolarization. So the few milliseconds of an action potential, you can say that the sodium potassium ATPase pump has no role. It only functions to try to normalize the actual resting membrane potential after the action potential has been generated. Yeah. I don't know whether I answered your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I'll get it.
Right.
Ronaldi, unmute, Ronaldi.
Hi, Ronaldi.
Ronaldi, unmute
Professor,
now.
to ask if we compare hydrocarbons such as Na and glucose, then which one is easier to enter and exit the membrane?
Oh.
Yeah, the sound system is a little bit fragmented.
Chat aja kalau nggak ada.
Hello? Ronaldi?
Okay. If we compare between hydrocarbons such as and ion A, then which one is easier to exit the cell membrane?
Comparison between carbon and
Na ion.
Sodium. Anion?
Yes.
Yes, sodium. So which one is?
easier to enter and exit the membrane.
Oh, the sensitivity of membrane gate between carbon and sodium, Professor Cheng, I think. The question about that.
Between carbon, is it calcium or carbon?
Yeah, calcium, I think, not carbon.
Calcium.
Calcium and sodium, which
Oh, okay.
one is very sensitive to enter the membrane gate.
Oh, I see. Calcium, not yeah, cannot be carbon. Yeah, calcium has its own very unique transmembrane gradient. In fact, I will try to do a talk on calcium gradient. The calcium transmembrane gradient is perhaps even steeper, much more steeper than for sodium and potassium. Just for a little bit of quantitative aspect, outside the cell, the calcium is also in millimole, but inside the cell, it is maintained very low in micromole range. So the transmembrane gradient for calcium is very steep. It's almost 1,000 times steeper, 1,000 times greater when you compare the concentration of calcium outside and inside the cell. Once you move to muscle physiology, especially in cardiac and smooth muscle, you realize that this calcium transmembrane gradient is very important in order to trigger muscle contraction in both the cardiac and the smooth muscle. So it has its own, obviously, specific calcium channel. So you have voltage-gated calcium channel, you have ligand-gated or hormone-gated calcium channel. So the same principles also applies to other ion-gated channel. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Professor Cheng. This is a good question for that. So we still have 1 more minute.
Okay.
To finish our our session, because we will going to prayer time, Jumat prayer time.
Oh yeah, prayer times Friday.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So maybe there is one last question for Professor Cheng, or maybe Dr. Harry, can you give some? Oh, the last one. I have raised hand. Who is raised her hand? Or maybe Alpha, yeah. Alpha, please, Alpha. This is the last question for me, because we have time. If you have another question or some question, you can ask to Dr. Budi or me, so we can send it to Professor Cheng. Yeah, you can chat with us that you can share to Professor Cheng. So this is the last question from Afab. Okay, Afab, please unmute your Zoom.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof, for giving me the opportunity to ask. I want to ask the Prof, the sodium level is very important, Prof. Well, doctor, if we experience the sum of increased sodium level, and this will definitely experience disturbance. How do we maintain sodium level in the blood to remain stable? Thank you, Prof.
Yeah, I just about heard you. So sorry. My hearing is sometimes not so good. So you're asking about sodium concentration. Yeah, you have to repeat the question. So sorry, I couldn't hear you clearly.
Okay, please repeat your question.
How do we maintain sodium level in the blood to remain stable?
Okay.
Okay.
So you're asking about the extracellular sodium concentration?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is something which is not part of this short talk. I did mention that intracellular sodium is controlled by the sodium potassium ATPase, but not the extracellular. Now the extracellular sodium concentration is controlled by, let me just summarize by giving you the answer so that you can maybe go and read it up yourself. It's actually controlled by a hormone from your pituitary gland called antidiuretic hormone. Yeah. So the extracellular sodium concentration is controlled by
Pressure.
antidiuretic hormone, whereas the intracellular sodium is controlled by the sodium potassium ATPase.
Yeah. So which means that it is different part. Yeah, Professor Cheng. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you for the
Prof.
question.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, students and Professor Cheng, I believe it is a very interesting topic and talk and discussion, and I believe that our students very enthusiastic to listen your talk. And but the time is very limited for us. We only have we have to go to prior times in Palembang in several minutes.
Okay.
So I am sorry that I have to end this session, but I do believe this talking is will open the horizon, open the mind of our students, and more interesting to learn about physiology, especially about the natrium, sodium, and I believe will increase the horizon and increase the knowledge of the student. As you know that from this module, the second module, you already learn about the effect of some ion chemistry component like sodium, potassium, calcium for the living system in this block. And now you can understand more about how they give influence for the living one, especially in just one small side of the physiology. Yeah, sodium channel membrane sodium gradient. Only small things. So you have to learn so many things about this one, about the other parts. This is small thing, but very, very complicated, I think, but interesting. But you have to learn more about how they control in kidney, how they effort in brain, and another part of the body. So you must learn more about this one. Okay, Professor Chen, thank you very much for you.
Yeah.
If you are here, we will give you this one. But I'm sorry, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nah,
Yeah.
this one, yeah. Okay. Bye bye. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for
Bye-bye.
students. Thank you very much.
See you
Prof.
all students.
Hardy.
Yeah.
Ya, Dr. Harry, terima kasih banyak untuk sudah mengikuti kuliah kita hari ini. Dan hari ini kita sudah mencatat. Professor Cheng, I hope that is not the first one.
No, we hope to carry on. I've already listed at least 10 to 12 major concepts. Yeah. So we can meet another time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is only the first, and it will be the second. I think maybe several times.
Yes. Yeah. And it will be same short about 20 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Cheng.
Okay.
Selamat pagi. Bye. Say hello to your family and friends. Okay. Bye. Terima kasih adik-adik, Dr. Harry. Dr. Harry yang boleh. Ya, terima kasih adik-adik semua. Kita sudah dengarkan Profesor Cheng untuk memberikan kuliah, dan tadi itu hanya satu bagian kecil saja ya soal sodium gradient di transmembran ya. Banyak sekali yang harus Anda pelajari, dan tentu saja harus perlahan-lahan ya, step by step. Ya, you cannot understand all of them in one moment. I believe you have to learn more and more and more. So until in clinical sector also you will learn more about this one. Oke, terima kasih Profesor Cheng, adik-adik semua.
Thank you.
Harry, terima kasih banyak. Mungkin ada sesuatu yang disampaikan Dr. Harry?
Enggak ada. Bagus sekali kuliahnya ya.
Okay. Thank you.
Very good lecture.
Professor Cheng, thank you very much.
Professor Cheng.
Terima kasih. Sampai jumpa.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend.
Yes. Bye. Yeah.